September 3rd, 1943. If you were an American factory worker that morning, the war didn't look like Europe. It looked like a time clock, a lunch pail, and a factory floor that never went quiet. If you were a German civilian, the war didn't look like soldiers either. It looked like smoke on the horizon, and a sound in the sky that didn't stop. This story isn't about generals, it isn't about battle maps, it's about grandparents, on both sides of the Atlantic, who never fired a weapon, but still fought one of the most decisive battles of the war. And most of them never knew it. In the United States, the war arrived without bombs. It arrived through factory windows lit at 3 in the morning, through machines that ran 24 hours a day, through women and men who worked shifts so long they stopped counting hours, steel mills in Pennsylvania, aircraft plants in California, shipyards along the East Coast, places where ordinary Americans, farmers, mechanics, shop clerks were suddenly told that what they built could decide whether someone else lived or died. Many of them had sons overseas, some had brothers already missing, others didn't know anyone fighting at all, but they showed up anyway, because the war had asked them to. Across the ocean, in Germany, the war felt different. Factories still stood, railroads still ran. The war machine still looked powerful on paper, but something had started to change. German civilians noticed it first, long before officers admitted it. Trains arrived late. Replacement parts didn't come. Machines sat idle, waiting for components that never showed up. And above all, the sky was no longer empty. American bombers didn't just attack cities, they attacked time. They attacked the idea that Germany could replace what it lost. Every destroyed factory wasn't just a building gone, it was weeks of lost production. Every damaged rail yard wasn't just tracks, it was supplies that never reached the front. German workers began sleeping inside factories to keep them running. Families moved closer to plants so shifts could start faster. Still, it wasn't enough, because while Germany repaired, America replaced. In the United States, production numbers climbed so fast they barely made sense. More planes in a month than Germany could build in a year. More tanks than crews to drive them. More trucks than roads to park them on. American workers joked that the factories were winning the war. They didn't know how right they were. In Germany, something else happened. For the first time, the war wasn't just out there anymore. It was in kitchens, in shelters, in letters sent home that grew shorter and quieter. German civilians didn't need propaganda to tell them something was wrong. They could feel it. And somewhere deep inside Germany's leadership, the truth was becoming impossible to ignore. The war wasn't being lost on the battlefield, it was being lost behind it. This is the part of the war your grandparents rarely talked about, the part without medals, without headlines, without victory parades. Because it didn't feel heroic at the time, it felt like exhaustion, like uncertainty, like watching a future slowly run out, and this was only the beginning. January 11th, 1944. By the start of 1944, the war had entered a phase most people never see in movies. No charges, no speeches, no dramatic last stands. Just numbers. In the United States, factory managers stopped talking about whether production could increase and started arguing about how much faster it could go. In Germany, officials stopped asking for more materials and started asking what could be done without them. That difference would decide everything. In American factories, the work never slowed. It multiplied. Men who had never seen Europe were suddenly building planes that would fly over it. Women who had never touched heavy machinery were assembling engines that would cross oceans. Grandparents who would later say, "I just worked a job," were unknowingly part of the largest industrial surge in human history. Aircraft rolled out faster than pilots could be trained. Tanks were built faster than units could be equipped. Trucks filled ports, rail yards, and fields, waiting for orders. The United States wasn't just producing weapons, it was producing certainty. Inside Germany, the war felt different. Factories still existed, workers still showed up, but the rhythm was broken. Bomb damage meant machines were moved underground. Power shortages meant production stopped without warning. Skilled workers were pulled into the army and never replaced. German civilians noticed it in small ways: a missing bolt, a delayed shipment, a machine that stayed silent for days. These weren't headlines, but they were warnings. German leadership tried everything. Factories were dispersed, production was simplified, parts were redesigned to use less metal, less time, less labor. But simplification had limits. A tank still needed an engine, a plane still needed fuel, a war still needed time, and time was something Germany no longer controlled. In America, time worked differently. Factories were rebuilt if damaged, shifts were added if demand rose, mistakes were corrected, and then production continued. There was no need to hide machines underground, no need to choose between electricity and air defense. The distance itself became a weapon. American grandparents didn't hear bombers overhead. They heard whistles signaling another shift, and every shift meant something new crossed the Atlantic. German civilians began to feel the imbalance before soldiers did. Letters from the front changed. At first, they spoke of movement, then of delays, then of waiting. Waiting for fuel, waiting for spare parts, waiting for equipment that never came. A broken truck became a major problem. A damaged rail line became a crisis. And slowly, quietly, the war machine began to consume itself. Some German factory managers kept working even after it became clear the output no longer mattered. They worked because stopping meant surrender, and surrender wasn't allowed. American factory workers kept working because they believed, sometimes without realizing it, that every unit completed shortened the war. Both sides were exhausted, but only one side could replace exhaustion with output. This is where the war stopped being fair, not because of courage, not because of skill, but because one nation could afford to lose and still keep building. By early 1944, American production wasn't just overwhelming Germany, it was outpacing the future. Germany could still fight, but it could no longer recover. And somewhere between an American factory floor and a German assembly line, the war crossed a line it could never uncross. The imbalance was now permanent. The question was no longer if Germany would fall, only how long it would take for everyone to accept it. June 6, 1944. By the summer of 1944, something fundamental had shifted. The war was still being fought with guns and bombs, but its outcome was already being decided somewhere else, in places that would never appear on battlefield maps. In the United States, the work continued almost mechanically. Factories no longer celebrated milestones, they simply moved on to the next order. More planes, more trucks, more engines. American grandparents would later say things like, "We were tired, but everyone was tired." What they didn't realize was that exhaustion meant something very different on the other side of the ocean. In Germany, exhaustion was no longer just physical. It was structural. By mid-1944, German industry had reached a point where it could no longer replace what it lost, no matter how hard people worked. Bombing had destroyed more than buildings. It had destroyed timing. A factory might survive an attack, but its power station wouldn't. A rail yard might be repaired, but the locomotives wouldn't arrive. A machine could be rebuilt, but the skilled worker who knew how to run it was already dead, wounded, or fighting on the front. German grandparents felt it first at home. Electricity cut out without warning, transportation slowed to a crawl. Food deliveries became unreliable. The war was no longer something their sons were fighting. It was something they were living inside. On the front lines, soldiers noticed something strange. Equipment arrived incomplete. Vehicles broke down and stayed broken. Ammunition was rationed, not by choice, but by necessity. German officers stopped requesting improvements. They requested repairs. And sometimes, they received nothing at all. Meanwhile, in America, production reached a point where choice replaced desperation. If a model failed, a new one replaced it. If a part broke, another arrived. If a strategy changed, industry adjusted. American factories were no longer racing Germany, they were racing time itself. And they were winning. This was the moment when even Germany's leadership could no longer hide reality from itself. Hitler still demanded results, still issued orders, still believed in willpower over material limits. But willpower couldn't produce fuel, it couldn't replace aluminum, it couldn't rebuild shattered rail networks fast enough. The system was running, but it was running on borrowed momentum. German civilians sensed it in quieter ways. Air raid shelters filled faster than factories. Children learned the sound of bombers before they learned multiplication. Elderly parents waited for letters that never arrived. Hope didn't vanish overnight. It thinned, and when hope thins, people stop imagining victory and start imagining survival. In the United States, people didn't see this collapse directly. They saw newspapers, photographs, announcements of advances. But they felt something else. They felt that the war was moving toward an end. Not because the fighting stopped, but because production never did. Every shift completed meant another day closer to homecoming. Every unit shipped meant another letter that might arrive instead of a telegram. By late 1944, the imbalance between American output and German capacity wasn't just visible. It was irreversible. Germany could still fight battles, but it could no longer fight the future, and everyone, on both sides, began to sense it. The war wasn't ending yet, but its direction had already been chosen. April 30th, 1945. By the time the war in Europe was ending, most people already knew the truth, even if no one said it out loud. Germany hadn't simply been defeated on the battlefield. It had been outbuilt. For German civilians, the final months didn't feel like collapse. They felt like absence. Trains that no longer ran, factories that stood silent, machines that waited for parts that would never arrive. The war didn't end with a single moment. It ended slowly, as things stopped working. German grandparents remembered it differently than soldiers did. They remembered standing in empty workshops, remembered tools that no longer mattered, remembered how effort continued long after purpose disappeared. Some still went to work, even when there was nothing left to build, because stopping meant accepting what had already happened. In the United States, the war ended in a quieter way. Factories didn't shut down overnight. Shifts didn't stop immediately. Machines didn't fall silent. They simply slowed. American grandparents would later say things like, "One day they told us to go home." And that was it. No explosion, no parade inside the factory, just silence where noise had been. Only years later did many of them understand what they had been part of, that the war wasn't only decided by soldiers in uniform, but by ordinary people who showed up every day and built something that crossed an ocean. They built planes they would never fly, tanks they would never drive, ships they would never see again. And somewhere in Germany, civilians lived with the opposite memory of repairing, rebuilding, improvising, until there was nothing left to repair. This is why many grandparents didn't talk about the war. Not because they were hiding something, but because what they experienced didn't feel heroic. It felt like endurance, like showing up tired, like doing work without knowing its full weight, like realizing years later that history had passed quietly through their hands. When people say America won the war or Germany lost, they're often talking about battles. But this story lives somewhere else. It lives in factories, in rail yards, in workshops, in people who never fired a weapon, but still decided the outcome. The war ended in Europe without most civilians ever seeing the front line. But they felt it, on both sides, in Germany when production stopped, in America when it finally slowed. And for a brief moment after the war, the world was quiet enough to realize something uncomfortable. That the most powerful weapon of the war wasn't a bomb. It was the ability to keep building, longer than the other side could endure. This is the part of World War II that doesn't fit neatly into movies, but it's the part many families remember most clearly, because it wasn't about glory. It was about exhaustion. And who could survive it longer? If stories like this matter to you, and if you believe moments like these deserve to be remembered, you can support this channel by liking and subscribing. And if you'd like to help keep long-form war stories alive, you can support through a donation. Connect on Instagram.